Today's passage is Jeremiah chapter 8 verses 18 through 22 and chapter 9 verse 1. Let's read together. You who are my comforter in sorrow, my heart is faint within me. Listen to the cry of my people from a land far away. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king no longer there? Why have they aroused my anger with their images, with their worthless foreign idols? The harvest is past, the summer has ended, and we are not saved. Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn, and horror grips me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is there no healing for the wound of my people? Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. Amen. People often say that the place where we live today is a global age in which everything is connected as one. If we simply have one smartphone in our hand, and if we move our fingers just a few times, we can easily come across news from the other side of the earth. Through artificial intelligence, this thing we call AI, even when languages are different and cultures are different, if we have just a little interest and move our fingers a few times, we can easily access news from all over the world. People often call this kind of society a hyper-connected age. The same is true of information about individuals. There are cases in which personal information is leaked, but through personal social media, what kind of life a person is living is also opened up to many people. That is the age in which we live today, the hyper-connected age. And yet, while we are living in this hyper-connected age where news and information are delivered in real time, I find myself thinking that in our relationships we are living very far from deep connection. Information is connected, but in relationships we're also living in an age of lonely disconnection. That is our reality. There was a Jewish philosopher named Martin Buber. Among the representative books he wrote is a book called I and Thou. In that book, he explains human relationships by dividing them into two kinds. One is the relationship of I and it, in which we treat the other person as a tool for my benefit or amusement, or simply as an object. Treating someone only as a piece of information or knowledge is also included here. When we see another person's tragedy on a smartphone screen and simply pass by it as something to watch, when we consume it as gossip, that condition is the relationship of I and it. On the other hand, he says there is the relationship of I and thou. The relationship of I and thou is a relationship in which I see the other person as a precious person just like myself, and sincerely face that person's joy and sorrow as if they were my own. In other words, it is a relationship in a state of empathy. That is what he calls the relationship of I and thou. What Buber wants to say is that the secret by which human beings can become truly human and form a warm community lies precisely in this relationship of I and thou, that is, in the ability to deeply empathize with the suffering of another. Suffering is a deeply painful emotion, an emotion we want to avoid, and it may seem like an emotion with a cold boundary around it. But when we empathize with that suffering, when we share the heart of the thing that suffers and the person who suffers, there is an amazing power by which relationship person and person can be joined as one and connected into one relationship. Jeremiah, whom we have recently been meeting and meditating on through iWorship, was a person full of this empathy for suffering. But the empathy for suffering that Jeremiah carried was very broad in scope. This is because the suffering Jeremiah carried embraced both the lament of God and the lament of the people. Jeremiah's spirituality of empathy embraced both empathy toward God and empathy toward his own people. The period when Jeremiah was active was the late 7th century before Christ. At that time, the international situation was one in which the Assyrian Empire, which had been a great power, was collapsing, and a new empire, called Babylon, was rapidly rising. It was a time when the international order was being shaken on a massive scale. In the middle of that great historical storm, the kingdom of Judah was in a crisis in which it did not know when it might collapse. But the greater problem was not the international situation. The spiritual and moral corruption inside Judah was the more serious problem. Kings and leaders, even religious leaders, were sunk in spiritual ignorance and greed and were walking the road to destruction. That was the reality of southern Judah at that time, and the false prophets, even though they knew there was no peace, said, "Peace, there is no problem," and blocked the eyes and ears of the people. The temple where God's presence dwelt was swarming with hypocrites who sinned and then took refuge there in order to be guaranteed safety. That is why such terrifying declarations are contained in the book of Jeremiah. Do not pray in the temple. I will not listen to the prayer. The temple will collapse. The passage we read today comes immediately after God's severe judgment has been proclaimed. It is the part that contains the cry of the prophet Jeremiah, who looked with spiritual eyes at the devastating result that judgment would bring. Jeremiah not only proclaims the sorrowful heart of God, who declares judgment against his own people, but also carries and speaks from the heartbreaking condition of the people standing before judgment. He is suffering that pain together with them. That is why biblical scholars describe Jeremiah as a prophet with a spirituality of empathy. These things seem to show us what kind of life God desires from us, we who today live in a hyper-connected age and yet also live in an age of lonely disconnection. It is not a relationship that treats others as information, as I and it, as if they had nothing to do with us. Rather, it tells us that in the midst of this world we must know the heart of God through a spirituality of empathy, and we must also embrace the pain of this world and walk by faith. That is the life of the people of God. Especially when you read today's passage, what thought comes to your mind? As you read today's passage verse by verse, it feels difficult to tell where the words of the prophet Jeremiah end and where the lament of God begins. The voice of Jeremiah weeping with a broken heart as he sees the destruction of the people, the voice of the people groaning in pain, and the voice of God lamenting over such a people are mixed together in today's passage. Whether it is the lament of the prophet or the sound of the lament of the people, or the sound of the lament of God, the passage moves back and forth. That passage is today's text. Biblical scholars sometimes divide this structurally, but no matter how many times we read it, within those verses the lament of the prophet, the lament of God, and the lament of the people are intertwined. It is not easy to cut it off clearly and say whose lament it is or whose words they are. What matters is that the lament is not only mixed together in this way, but layered together as one. The lament of God and the lament of the people are being joined together within Jeremiah. That is the part of today's passage to which we need to pay attention. Also, when we look at the content of the passage in terms of the meaning of the original language, the weight of the sorrow with which God and human beings grieve in mutual empathy comes to us even more heavily. In verse 18 of today's passage, Jeremiah says, "You who are my comforter in sorrow, my heart is faint within me." This expression refers, in its original language sense, to a condition in which one tries by every means to hold back sorrow, yet the sorrow bursts out because one cannot restrain it by one's own will. Have you ever experienced that? You are so exhausted, so wounded, and so sad that you desperately want to hold back your tears, but tears flow from your eyes, and even the sound of your voice comes out strained and broken. It is a state of lament in which, no matter how much you try to hold it in, you cannot control yourself. That, they say, is the picture of Jeremiah when he says, "Alas, my sorrow and my grief." Also, in the passage, the expression "my people" or "the daughter of my people" appears often in verses 19, 20, and 22. This expression is a title used in the ancient world for a young daughter whom parents cherished and had to protect as their own life. The wound Jeremiah experiences is not worry or anxiety spoken from far away, like watching a fire across a river. It tells us that the suffering the people are now enduring, and the judgment God is speaking of, is a pain and lament as if his own inner being were being torn apart. In verse 21, the expression, "I am crushed," appears. The meaning of the original word is that he has been shattered to pieces. It means to be broken into fragments. God is shattering the people of Judah completely, and that tearing, that complete breaking, is being synchronized exactly into the heart of Jeremiah. We can see that. So in order to bring healing, verse 22 looks for the balm of Gilead, which was famous as a medicine at that time, and for a physician. What is this lament? Is there no physician there? It means he is trying to heal. He is trying to restore. And yet it tells us that the shattered pain and suffering Judah has suffered was such extreme agony and distress that even the greatest physicians and the greatest medicines of that time could not heal it. In the end, what does Jeremiah say in chapter 9 verse 1? "Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears," he comes to cry out with tears. Jeremiah is shedding tears as he empathizes with both the sorrow of God and the sorrow of the people. Can you sense what kind of emotion it is to say that he weeps day and night, all day long? Through this spirituality of empathy there is an important truth we must remember. True faith can begin from holy grief, from the ability to ache as we look at a broken altar and as we look at a broken spiritual condition. The collapse of our relationship with God, The collapse in the reality of our worship, the loosening of our life of worship, as we look at those places and begin to feel spiritual concern, our true faith finds the opportunity to rise again. This is because knowing the heart of God begins through this holy grief. At the same time, what we must remember is this: we must hold on to the relationship of I and thou, the spirituality of empathy that can mourn with those who mourn and weep with those who weep. If we say that we know the heart of God, and yet pass by the pain of our neighbors in the place where we live, then in truth we do not really know the heart of God. Does not 1 John also say this? It says that if someone says he loves God but does not love his enemy, his neighbor, he is a liar. If we truly love God, then the reality that we are unable to love must make us uncomfortable. It may be natural that we cannot love because there is no love in us. But if that does not make us uncomfortable, then in truth we do not really know the love of God either. True faith can begin through holy grief over spiritual things, and through the spirituality of empathy that shares in the pain of the neighbors with whom we live. That seems to be the heart of God being delivered to us today through Jeremiah. Then finally, I think we need to speak about how we can receive this spirituality of empathy that is required of us for true faith. In conclusion, we need to hold on to the cross of Christ. Jeremiah's tears overlap, across many years, with the tears of Jesus, who wept as he looked at the collapse of the temple in Jerusalem. If you look at Luke chapter 19, on the road of Jesus' journey as he was going toward the cross, we see Jesus looking at the temple of Jerusalem and shedding tears. Jesus knew the heart of God and wept before the temple that would collapse, before that temple stained by sin. But Jesus not only knew the heart of God, he also had pain for human beings on this earth who were running toward death, human beings moving toward the wages of sin. That is why, in a place like John chapter 11, when he sees the death of Lazarus, he is deeply moved and weeps. Those were tears of pain over the destiny of human beings blocked by the despair of death, and he ran toward the cross, and before the cross he shed tears of anguish, and he was nailed to the cross, and died. In Hebrews chapter 5, the tears of Jesus, the tears before the cross, are recorded. Jesus was the savior of empathy, carrying the fullness of empathy that Jeremiah had embraced. Therefore, when we hold on to that Jesus, when we engrave that cross upon our hearts, we too can follow after that spirituality of empathy. Beloved, in this collapsing age and in broken communities, with what kind of faith are we living? Are we cynical observers who point out and condemn their sins? Or are we bystanders who turn away from the pain and simply swipe past it on a smartphone screen? Now we must synchronize our hearts with the pain of God confirmed on the cross. And we must take the tears of wounded neighbors on this earth and the spiritual crisis of the church as our own tears and pain, kneel before God, and live while meditating on the heart of God. We must cast away the cold gaze of I and it, and move forward into the warm empathy of I and thou. I earnestly hope that our lives today will be lives that carry the sorrow of God in our hearts, embrace the sorrow of the community in our own chest, and heal the world with the love of the cross of Jesus Christ. Like Jeremiah, and like Jesus, may you and I become people who live with the spirituality of empathy. I bless you in the name of the Lord.